Maddie, who is a listener of mine, sent me this piece of audio. This is from Tennessee in 2022. Maddie says, "My aunt was hunting during this last deer season, and she'd been hearing these strange noises going on around her and her husband for a while they were coming back to the truck. She managed to get this sound recorded, and I was curious to know if you could tell us what it is. It seemed to have followed them out as they left for the night." Let's take a listen. Well, that's about the most terrifying sound I've ever heard.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Come on, Tia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
In for night vision.
This is Dan.
And this is Laura.
We are from Berwyn, Illinois, and you're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. I might go back to the old intro. I'm not sure. I know not everyone is in love with it, but it's kind of growing on me. I may switch it back. We'll find. I guess you guys will find out in the future. Tonight we're going to be chatting with Josh. And Josh comes to us from Kentucky. And growing up, his whole family kind of lived on this property. It was mainly his uncle's property out there in Kentucky, but his folks lived on a portion of the property. And Josh recounts over 20 years ago seeing this monkey, what he thought was a very large monkey in the barn. And they've had a few encounters out there with this creature. I'll kind of let Josh go into it. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com, and if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Josh to the show. Josh, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And Josh, if you would, tell me a little bit about this property out there in Kentucky, and when did all of this kind of start out there?
So where I live, near Owensboro, Kentucky, on just west and north of town, there's a large area of hills. It's called Barn Harbor Hills. And the way it was explained to me originally, and I may have read it in a book on the history of this county, is that they're ancient sand dunes, and they're just kind of all bunched together in this like 5 square mile area, and then everything else around it is flat river bottoms. There's a lot more rolling hills on the other end of the county, but these are just kind of just shoved together in this one little area. So my uncle owns quite a bit of property on the north end of it, and along the northern and western edge of these hills, it's just one solid ridge line with a few ravines here and there kind of breaking it up. And this ridge is probably 100, 150 foot tall. It's pretty, it's got a lot of size to it, and it's steep on the outer rim of it. It's very steep. And so my uncle owns a construction company. He bought a lot of property along the northern edge of it, and what they do is they dig into it with bulldozers and backhoes, and they haul dirt out of there and take it to where all these subdivisions are being built around here, and they use it to make basically the bases for the houses to build the footers on. So over the years, they've taken all this dirt out, and they've put a sizable opening up into these hills, and there's a pretty good sized lake there and everything. And I go up there fishing all the time. And let's see, all this really started in about 2002. I was about 12 or 13, and my uncle had bought more property to the west. He'd brought the neighboring field and part of the ridge line right there. And so I was helping him one day. I think it was spring break. It was like middle of spring. And so both my parents were at work, so I was with my uncle helping him. He was on a big D9 Caterpillar dozer, massive piece of equipment. And he was using it to knock down some trees in a tree line right at the edge of the property where the railroad tracks run through. And so if you're standing in the property looking north, there's railroad tracks. Just on the other side of the railroad tracks is a road that falls down through there. And that's the way you get in and out of the property, is you come down this road, cross the railroad tracks at a crossing he put in, and then you're in the property. And then about another half a mile north is the Ohio River. So I'm sitting on a small Ford tractor with a little grater blade on the back of it. He would make passes up and down through there, tearing these trees down, pulling the roots up out of the ground with the blade on the dozer. And then once he'd get out of the way, I'd go through with the little tractor and kind of drag some of the roots and stuff out of the way. He'd make another pass, rinse and repeat. So I'm sitting on this tractor in the middle of the field, and I'm facing him. The ridge line is behind me, and it's covered with trees. And over in the far corner of this field, about 20 feet inside of the woods, is an old abandoned barn. And you could still kind of see most of it. The foliage hadn't come all the way out on the trees at this point. And behind that barn was one of those real steep, narrow ravines that ran back up into the rest of those hills. So I'm sitting there watching him. This is the middle of the day. I think it was just after lunch, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He's going full blast with this dozer. And all of a sudden, from behind me, from back up in the area of this ravine, I hear the loudest roar that I've ever heard. I immediately know it's some kind of animal, and I heard it and I felt it. It was so loud, and the only thing I can describe it as, it was like a combination of a lion's roar and the roar of the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. Immediately the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I got real frightened because I heard it over the sound of the tractor was idling and over the sound of this bulldozer going wide open. And I turned and looked back to where this barn was just in time to see deer and rabbits and raccoons and everything, every kind of animal that must have been up in this ravine just kind of hanging out, just bolting right out of there and scattering as soon as they got to the edge of it. And I thought, okay, that's weird. And didn't think too much more of it, and turned around and went back to watching my uncle, waiting to make another pass. Well, about 5 minutes later, the hair on the back of my neck stands up again. I get that feeling I'm being watched. So I turn around and I look back again towards that barn, and I just see this massive figure standing in the doorway of the barn. The barn had no doors on it. There's just this big opening on the front of it. And I see it. It's leaning out and it's looking right at me. And he's got his left arm is curled up over the beam that runs across the top of the door opening. And he's kind of leaned out a little bit, and I realize he's hunched over a little bit. He's not standing at full height, and he's just kind of leaned out, kind of swaying back and forth a little bit. He's got his right arm is hanging straight down, and he's just sitting there watching me. And I didn't know what it was at the time. At the time, I didn't realize Bigfoot was such a big deal, and like it was a real thing. I'd seen Harry and the Hendersons, and I'd seen, maybe a few episodes of Monster Quest on Discovery Channel or History Channel. And, that's all I knew of it. And of course, also, I only thought it was a Pacific Northwest thing, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. I didn't think they were in Kentucky. So I turn around and just kind of try to pretend that it's not there. And a few minutes later, I look back again. It's still there. And it was probably there for the better part of 25 to 30 minutes, just watching us. And then finally, the feeling went away. I turned and looked, and it was gone. And so later that afternoon, before we left, my uncle was getting his stuff packed up. It was either dumb or just brave, and walked over to this barn and walked up into it to where that doorway was. And at this time, I'm 6'3", and at the time I was maybe 6'1", only just a couple inches shorter than I am now. And I realized, the thing's head was right at the top of this doorway. And I'm looking up at the top of the doorway, and I'm reaching up with my hand, and I can just barely get my fingertips to the beam that it had its arm wrapped around of. So this thing had to have been at least 8.5 feet tall to be standing crouched the way it was in this doorway.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of guys like in the lumber and forestry industry, and they're out there working and there's large pieces of equipment, and they'll hear these things vocalize over their piece of machinery. And I mean, that tells you how loud it is, especially if you're sitting there on a tractor that's idling. And I know that D9 Caterpillar, that bulldozer that your uncle was using, those things are like 50 tons. They're loud, very, very loud. And it has a cab, if I remember right. And, even when you're sitting in that cab, you really can't hear much. Did you ever talk to your uncle? Did he hear that roar?
No, he didn't notice it at all. He was pretty unfazed. It didn't faze him. Even if he did hear it, he just didn't pay any attention to it. And I was sitting on the tractor maybe 20 to 30 yards away from him, and I was right about dead center of this field. And then where the barn was probably 50 to 60 yards away from where I was. It's not a very big field. So, you can see all the way across it pretty easy. You don't have trouble seeing what's what from one side to the other. So I got a fairly good look at it, but yeah, he didn't notice it. When we were leaving, I didn't say anything to him about it, and just kind of kept it to myself because, my uncle, he's a very avid hunter. He goes deer hunting up in those woods all the time, but he's a no nonsense kind of person. So I knew if I told him, he wouldn't believe me. So I'd kept it to myself for the longest time.
Yeah, I hear you. He's kind of no nonsense. Plus, like I said, that D9 Caterpillar, man, that thing's loud. That thing's really loud, especially when you're in the cab. It's really hard to hear anyone. I wanted to ask you, so when you looked back at this creature that was standing in the doorway of the barn, was it kind of an outline, or was there any details that you remember?
I mean, I could see some details. I could tell it was covered by like this jet black fur, or maybe even hair. And its face looked kind of a grayish, blackish, almost kind of a color. And I could tell it had eyes and kind of a flattish looking nose on it. But, I couldn't see a mouth or anything like that. I could definitely see a hand where its right arm was hanging down. I could see a hand, and the fingers looked like they didn't really have any hair or anything on them. They were kind of the same, almost grayish color as the middle of the face. But, I mean, that's, kind of every time I looked at it, I just went straight for the eyes of it, and it was just watching us. And what I think might have been part of it is, this was a lot of activity going on this property that never normally happened on this property at this time of year. So, it may have been hibernating or sleeping or whatever. And, we changed the schedule of things that, kind of happened in that area and disturbed it.
Yeah, I think that you're spot on, Josh, with what was going on there. I think the roar was kind of an FU directed towards you and your uncle. And there's a lot of accounts, like I said, I've had forestry workers out there clearing brush, bulldozing things, cutting down trees. And there's many accounts of these things will come out of the wood line and either roar or scream at people working. And I've had many forestry workers tell me it was louder than the equipment we were running. So I get it. And I know you're a kid at this point and you're looking back and, I think you probably would handle the situation a little different today, but I get it. If you, when you're a kid, if you look away, it'll go away. Even some adults have that take on things. But when you were looking at this thing, what did you think it was? Did you think it was just some weird, huge guy hanging out in your guys' rundown barn?
I really, at the time, my mind's racing trying to figure out, what is this thing? What could it be? And, I hadn't heard any really stories of the area or anything like that. And, just tried to brush it off as, okay, there's some kind of giant monkey in the barn watching us. And just tried to ignore it and hope it would go away and wouldn't come out and come near us. Because I knew, like my uncle, I knew he always carried, so I knew he had a pistol on him. But as big as this thing was, I just knew in my back of my mind, that's not going to do anything to this thing if it tries to come for us. So I'll just ignore it and hope it goes away.
Yeah, I get it, man. I definitely get it. I know there's been a lot of different things that have happened on this property and actually around this property. Tell me about the next incident. What happened? When did it happen? And just kind of walk us into it.
I think this was a year or so later. On the other end of these hills, where I lived with me and my parents' house at the time, which they still live there now, they were just down at the bottom of the ridge on the western end of it. And my cousin lived next door and their house was up on top of this ridge. And so I would go up and hang out with him all the time up there. And we had built a decent little fort in the woods on back, still right on top of this ridge, maybe, I want to say 200 yards from his house, which was closer to the highway that ran through there. And we were probably about 1,000 yards from my house. So from our fort on top of this, it was kind of a knob because there was like a little ravine on each side of where we were. But from where our fort was, you could see his house clearly and you could see my house clearly. And this was fall. This was probably fall of the next year. So we had lit a fire and had a decent little campfire going. We were, roasting marshmallows, hot dogs and stuff, hanging out. And we were telling jokes to each other. And I remember I let out some kind of a loud cackle at one of the jokes that my cousin told me. And right after I let this cackle out, from right down at the very bottom of the hill, which would have been out into the kind of a cow pasture they have down there, I heard the loudest single whistle I've ever heard. Like, it sounded like if it was just one straight note for about 4 seconds. And, at first we thought maybe my cousin's dad or his uncle that lived, just not too much further from where we were was messing with us. But it was so loud and had so much force to it. It felt like if a regular person was making this, they should have been 10, 15 feet away from us. And we couldn't see anything. With our fire going, we turned our flashlights on, we couldn't see anything. So, I never gave it much thought until probably 4 or 5 years later when I really started digging into Bigfoot research and stuff like that, and reading accounts of where people had heard these loud whistles. And that made me think back on that, like, okay, well, that must have been a Bigfoot messing with us. Because I've never heard a whistle that loud and not have something or someone be close enough to me for it to be that loud. It was almost like it was right next to your ears. But whatever it was probably 100 yards away from us.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've heard that real sharp whistle when I was at the Browns property here in Washington State. I remember even looking over at Jonathan, asking him if there was someone on his property, because it sounds like a human doing it, but it's a lot louder. It's way louder than a human would do it. But it kind of reminds me of, like when I used to work in the lumber yard, we had all the equipment running, and you don't know when it's break or when it's lunch, and the foreman would always do that real sharp whistle from all the way from the other side of the lumber yard, and you could hear him. And I would see why you would pass it off, and I would understand why a lot of people pass that off. It's a little weird to do that on someone's property, especially out there in the country,
Right. Part of this area too, it used to be a state park. Now the city owns it now. But, on the western end of these hills where my cousin and them lived, right behind their part of the property was where the state park was. And there's underground coal mines everywhere in this area. Some of them are capped. Some of them back in the deeper parts of the woods are still kind of open. So, there's plenty of hiding spots. It's full of deer. There's ponds and lakes back in there full of fish, ducks, everything. So I'm sure there's plenty of food sources for something big like that. It's even as small of an area as it is, something could hide back in there, and because nobody ever really goes back in there. One of the other things that was brought to my attention, when I started doing all the research, I joined. There was no Bigfoot researchers around here or anything, so there was a local paranormal investigators club. This was back when ghost hunters and all that was real big. And so I joined them and told them kind of what I was into, so I became the cryptid guy. If they got reports of stuff like that, I was the one that they told it to. So we go to one of our weekly meetings, and the president comes up and said, "Hey, I got a call from a hunter that I think you need to talk to him." Okay. So the next day I called the guy, and he said, "You look for Bigfoot stuff, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I try to." And he said, "Well, I don't know that it's Bigfoot." He said, "But I go hunting at this place in Bar Harbor Hills called Honda Hill." I'm like, okay. He said, "My deer stands up on the very top of the ridge." He said, "I've been waiting for them. They come out into the field." He said, "I'll get my shot off." He said, "But then I keep seeing what looks like a guy in a gorilla suit runs out of the woods at the bottom of the hill. He's grabbing my deer, throwing them over his shoulder, and running off with them." I was like, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yes." He says, "It's happened 3 times now." And I'm like, okay, well, next time, if you do go back, he said, I don't know if I'll go back after that. And he said, after the third time, I kind of realized, this is a 200-pound deer, and this thing's throwing it over its shoulder and running off with it like it's nothing. And he says, so I don't know if I'll ever go back in there after that. I'm like, well, if you do, please take a camera and try and get some pictures if you see it again, please. And then, contact me. And so that night, I'm at home and I'm trying to figure out where this place is. So I go to my dad and I'm like, hey, Dad, do you know where Honda Hill is? He goes, oh, yeah, that's the next field over from your uncle's property down there. I'm like, okay, so this correlates to what I've been seeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So all of that was happening right around where you saw this creature. Makes you wonder if it was the same creature that he saw that was picking up his deer.
It could have been. It could have been. And then probably 2 to 3 years later, I think I was probably about a senior in high school at this point. Me and my best friend, we went to my uncle's place one day to go fishing. And this was probably September of probably 07 or 08. And we went up there to go fishing and stuff. And, like I said, my uncle, for his construction company, they dig at this ridge line to get the dirt out and everything. And they'll keep digging and digging until they get down to the cap rock, which is shale. And then underneath that is coal. And then there's underground mines that run underneath this ridge line. And so they'll stop and then they'll start moving on into it until they hit it again. And then they'll move on again. So we got bored fishing, and this is probably about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we decided to walk from the lake. We went back to my truck, put our gear up, and started walking up the gravel road that goes up to what we called the high wall. And it's just this big wall of dirt where they would dig the dirt out from. And down at the bottom of it, all this exposed shale was there. So we start digging through there for fossils and stuff. We were finding seashell fossils and stuff like that in there. Thought it was pretty neat. And, we dig some shards out, and I'd kind of fling them over the top of the high wall into the ravine on the other side of it. And we did this for maybe an hour or two. It's getting closer to 5-ish, 5:30. It's starting to get late in the day. The sun's getting ready to start going down. We're having a good time finding stuff. And then all of a sudden I get hit in the head with a rock. And I thought it was my friend messing with me. I was like, hey, don't do that. I was like, that kind of hurt. And he said, what? I said, don't throw rocks at me. He said, I didn't throw anything at you. Okay, whatever. So just keep throwing them over the hillside and everything. And then he gets hit with one. And he starts getting on to me, and I'm like, I didn't do it. And about that time, I get hit with one again while we're looking at each other, and we realize they're coming from the ravine where we've been throwing the discarded rocks. And so we decided, okay, it's time to get out of here. We started walking back to my truck down this gravel road, and at one point, we get down where there's a big drainage ditch that drains out of the hills. And it kind of runs along the dam for my uncle's lake that we had been fishing in. And there's this wall of reeds growing out of the side of this ditch that they're probably 12 to 14 foot tall. So you can't see the lake on the other side of them. And so we start walking along this, on this gravel path, and we start hearing these big, heavy footsteps coming from the other side of the reeds. And we can't see nothing. They're so thick. And so we would stop. The footsteps would stop. And it was like 2 to 3 big, heavy footsteps to every 6 or 7 of ours. And it was keeping right in pace with us, right on the other side of the reeds. And so at this point, I looked at my buddy. I'm like, let's go. And we took off running to my truck. We were probably about 20 yards away from it. We get to the truck, which it's parked on the culvert that goes over top of this ditch. We jump in my truck. We're panicking. I can't find my keys. And I finally find them. I was sitting on them. And I start the truck up. I throw the headlights on. I rev it up as high as it'll go and hit my high beams. And this thing comes around the end of those reeds and heads straight up the hillside. And like I said, this hill's very steep, and it probably took all of 6 seconds for this thing to get from the bottom to the top. And then it was gone. And it had to have been, like 8 or 9 foot tall, but it was a grayish black. And I didn't see its face, but we saw arms and legs, and it was upright on 2 legs. I've never seen anything move that fast ever in my life for any other kind of animal. And I about broke the axles on my truck getting over the railroad tracks trying to get us out of there.
I don't blame you, Josh. I don't blame you at all, man. I would have gotten out of there too. But when it came out, it wasn't coming for you guys. It was actually running away.
Right. And that was, as soon as I had my truck started, revved it up real loud, threw the headlights on, and it ran right in front of my truck and went straight up that hillside. It was probably 2 to 3 foot taller than my truck.
Yeah, and I know all of this is happening very quickly, and you didn't really get a chance to look at the face, but what did your friend say?
And I think he got a little bit better look at it than me, because I was trying to get the truck into gear to get us out of there. I got a glimpse of it. He got a full look at it, and he was telling me about it, later on. And even he said, dude, I think that was a Bigfoot. I was like, yeah, I know. I've seen them here before. And he's like, you didn't tell me that? I was like, I forgot. This is, a couple years later from all the other stuff happening. And then after that, I really dove into, exploring the area, because I would go up in these hiking trails in the state park side of it all the time, and would find all, structures that I didn't realize at the time, what tree structures were and things like that. And I'd see them all the time and never give them a second thought. He actually reached out to me the other day. He wants to go back and start looking for it again. And so I think that'll be something here in the near future. Me and him, we're going to start going back to my uncle's place again and seeing if that activity is still there.
Yeah, they don't really seem to be very aggressive with you, and you'll find that sometimes. It's weird, when people have these things on their property, and they'll always say, I always thought there was something weird going on, or I was being watched. And a lot of times when they're on people's property, unless someone gets squirrely, generally these things don't seem to be very aggressive with you at all. They threw rocks, but you were kind of throwing rocks in its general direction. And gosh, I'd love to go back. I know I haven't been invited, but I would love to come check that property out with you. And I think the only researcher I really know in that area is probably Charlie Raymond. And I don't know Charlie Raymond, but my impression of him is he seems like a pretty good guy. He runs that Kentucky Bigfoot research organization, and like I said, I don't know him, but he seems like a good guy. Seems like a researcher with some class. I would love to go back with you guys. And has there been anything else that's happened?
I know there's a couple other times I went back and, I tried, wood knocking and all that, and I did get responses. I'd found a few halfway washed out footprints, probably 16 to 18 inches long, inside of that barn on a different occasion. And, went up exploring into those woods and found what looked like something that could have been nests, or where something may have been laying down and sleeping, and, tree breaks. The more I read into what people were describing as habits of these creatures, I started seeing that stuff everywhere up in those woods. And then, as I got older and, got jobs and stuff, and I just kind of quit going up there, But I'm starting to plan now on this year going back and just seeing if the activity is still there.
Yeah, I would obviously be careful going in there, but it's like I was saying earlier, when these creatures are on people's property, they've probably seen you more than you've seen them. And it's strange. You don't really find a ton of aggression when they're on people's property. It's when I think people go out and kind of push the limits, or these creatures push the limits, and guns start coming out. And I think that's where people get into a lot of trouble with regard to these creatures. But was that the last time you had seen the creature?
Pretty much, yeah. That's the last time I saw anything up there. There was another time where, my uncle had, that one ravine where the rocks were getting thrown back from, my uncle kind of cleared that area out and kind of made a deer plot for deer hunting. And it kind of had a bottleneck at one end of it, and it was a little swampy down on one end. And I was up in there one year, and it was the dead of winter. And I was walking through there, and things had kind of thawed out. Right in the middle of one of these little muddy patches, I looked down and I see what looked like a child's barefooted print, but it was fresh. Like it had probably been made within the last day or so. And it was probably 4 or 5 inches long, and it was a bare footprint. And I'm like, okay, there's got to be a family of them here, because nobody's letting their kid run barefoot out here in the woods in the middle of winter.
Yeah, it sounds like there's more than one on that property, and usually there is more than one, generally speaking. And, because the first one that you saw was more black, and the second one was gray, and now you're finding these tiny prints out there in the snow. And not only are you seeing it, you've had eyewitnesses with you who've seen it, and then you have people around the property who've seen it. And, I know your uncle is kind of like that hunter, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but, like that hunter saying, well, some guy in a gorilla costume picking up my deer and taking off with it. And he's done it several times. And if you really think about it, I mean, there's no guy in a gorilla costume picking up your deer and running off with it, because there's a reason why hunters quarter out elk and deer and that sort of thing, because you can't pick it up and walk off with it. After 20 years, did you ever, and I know your uncle's no nonsense, but after 20 years, did you ever go back to your uncle and say, hey, listen, I've seen it. I've been with people. They've seen it. People around this property are seeing it. Did you ever get a chance to kind of have that conversation?
I came to him with it one time and told him, I was like, hey, I've seen this thing on your property. Have you had anything happen or seen anything? He's like, oh, there ain't nothing up there. You're not seeing anything like that. He's like, I've got game cameras all over this place, and I ain't never seen anything on them like that. And, I just kind of left it at that. I mean, I wasn't going to tell him anything about, well, they can probably see those and avoid them. But, even him and, his son, my cousin, who hunts up there a lot, even they said, they've never seen anything like that up there.
Yeah, I understand. Makes me wonder how far back this goes of people seeing it right in this area, or even if there's other things going on the property.
From what I've heard, there used to be a house on the property, and back in the 70s, like Satanists used to do rituals in there and things like that, which this area, and then like all the way to the next county over back in the 70s, there were creature sightings everywhere in the mid 70s. For some reason, there was an outbreak of sightings. From what I was told, in the 70s, this Satanists or occultists or whatever were performing rituals in this house and stuff like that. And so they eventually had the house torn down because of it. And I think the last, even I heard about 7 or 8 years ago, across the road from my uncle's property at another old barn over there, one of the farmers came by one morning, and there was a pig's head sitting in the middle of a bloody pentagram drawn in the ground one morning. So some of that stuff is still going on around there, I guess. And then even, I don't know if there's like a bunch of iron ore in the ground up there too, but I know if you take a compass up in there, it'll spin, or it will not point the right way.
Yeah, very strange. I wanted to ask you, you've been talking to some of the neighbors and you've had your own encounters there. Has anyone in your family or, anyone near there reported seeing weird lights out in the forest?
Not so much weird lights, but on the other end near where my parents' house is, people have told me, oh, have you seen the eyes? I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, go to the end of the dead end road back there where the edge of the state park starts. And he said, go out there, turn your car and lights off, and sit there and watch the woods. And I did that one night, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, I started seeing these pairs of red eyes just kind of gliding through the trees. And there would be 2 or 3 pairs at a time kind of spread out over an area, and you could just see them up in the woods moving around. There'd be no sounds or anything like that. And it would happen, maybe once or twice a week. I could go back there and it would happen.
That's strange. What do you think those eyes were?
I have no idea. And I know somebody got a picture of them. I think a buddy of mine has a copy of that picture. And because there's an old cemetery up in those woods too. Actually, there was 2 of them. One of them supposedly had been moved, but there's still a couple headstones back there where that one was. But the main cemetery belonged to my church, and I helped restore part of it at one time. And somebody got a picture of those eyes, and they're just there. There's nothing around them. They're not attached to anything. And it's just the weirdest looking thing.
Yeah, that's definitely unnerving. And, I think if I would have seen red eyes out there floating through the trees, I think evil when I hear red eyes. It doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. That's just, my take on it. But these creatures, they've been reported. I mean, I've heard blue, yellow, green, red is a common one of people seeing these weird eyes that just kind of show up. And a lot of times that's when people see them first at night is because their eyes give them away. I'm not saying that's what it was, but that is fascinating. And I want to go back to the barn real quick, where you first saw this creature. It makes me wonder if they were living in that barn or using it as a shelter. How often did you guys go into that barn?
Not very often at all. I mean, it was abandoned. The back half of it was halfway collapsed. And you could go in there, and one part of it still had a bunch of like straw or hay in it, like something had made a nest in there at one time. And so I have no doubt they were using it as shelter at some point. And another correlation story I got was I went, a couple weeks ago to a Bigfoot meeting that one of the local researchers hosted at a local restaurant. They had over 100 people show up, and he asked me if I would share my stories. It's the first time I'd ever done that in public. And so, I told about what had happened, and afterwards I went to pay for my food, and this guy come up behind me and he said, "Hey, I know exactly what barn you're talking about." And he said, when we were kids, there used to be a story that a troll lived in that barn. The ravine behind the barn, and then there was a tree line next to it, and that's what was the property marker between the property my uncle owned and the Honda Hill property, because I guess back in the 70s and 80s, that's where all the kids rode their dirt bikes and stuff. And so that's what they were doing, is they were riding dirt bikes around the area. And I guess it was kind of one of those things, I dare you to go into that barn. And, the troll lives in there. He'll get you.
Yeah, it's kind of confirmation for you, really. I mean, they're calling it a troll riding their bike. It makes you wonder what they saw, and why they called it a troll. I know he didn't go into that much with you about it, but that is kind of cool that, he was saying, hey, don't go near that barn. There's a troll that lives in there. I want to ask you, after 20 years of weird experiences and around your uncle's property and then other people coming forward, I like to ask everyone, Josh, what do you think Sasquatch is? And the beauty of that question is no one really knows. But what is your take? What do you think these creatures are?
Yeah, I think they could be, flesh and blood creatures, and they've evolved 100% to be, in nature. They can take advantage of their natural surroundings, 100% completely. So that's why, you could never see them, or, there's, the world champion hide and seek kind of thing. They know what to do to make sure they're not seen. And, one thing about this area is there's railroad tracks that run straight through the area. And then you've got these large drainage and irrigation ditches that run through the area, and they could use those to travel and not be seen and not leave any evidence.
I think that's a fair answer, Josh. I mean, they do appear to be very physical. I mean, they leave trace evidence that they were there, whether it be footprints or hair or, other things. They definitely leave a trace, physical evidence behind that they were there. It's just weird we can't catch up with them. But it's definitely a fair answer.
There was one other report that was relayed to me about this lady, her and her sister, they grew up in a house that is within eyesight of my uncle's property. I mean, it's right between my uncle's property and the river. And the house, it may have been torn down recently. It may still be there. But she said that she was in the kitchen one night and she heard something and went and pulled the curtains back from the window and said there was this giant hair-covered red-eyed devil staring into the window at her, and said she screamed, and this thing took off running up into the hills, directly into the direction of where my uncle's property is now.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a long history of it out there on that property, and a lot of times when they find a property like that, they will hang out for sure, and I would love to know if they're still around that property, but I admire the fact that you would go out and find people, neighbors, and people in the area to see if they've seen anything strange out there, and it just gives you a lot of confirmation to what you saw and you and your friend saw, and I'm sure many other people around that area have seen, and it kind of gives you insight too on the creature's behavior and temperament. I really enjoyed chatting with you, Josh. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. I will stay in touch with you and let you know of anything else that happens.
Thanks again, Josh. Man, I'd love to go check out his uncle's barn, find out what in the world's going on over there. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone.
When the love still low when you want it bad, the lights on with nose in the hand, up in the heart. The lights on, my wheels unturned to go alone. The lights on, baby you should know without you I'm gone. With the lights on, this is my home. Place where I own memories of you, dear, and classic human and vital.